There was a moment in my spiritual journey when everything I believed about light, about divinity, about salvation itself came crashing down around me. I was sitting alone at 3 in the morning, ancient texts spread across my desk, when I read something in the Gospel of Philip from Nag Hammadi that made my hands tremble. The words were simple, almost too simple, yet they carried a truth so profound that I felt physically sick. Jesus had warned his closest disciples about a deception so vast, so complete, that nearly 2,000 years later, billions of souls still worship the very force that keeps them imprisoned. He called it the false light. And in that moment, I understood why the early church fathers burned these texts, why they hunted down every Gnostic community, why they were so desperate to erase this knowledge from history. The being that most of the world worships as God, the entity that demands obedience and fear, that promises salvation through submission, is not the true divine source at all. It is the demiurge, the false creator, the Archon of ignorance wearing the mask of divinity, and the entire structure of Orthodox religion was built to keep you kneeling before it. What I am about to share with you has been suppressed for nearly 2 millennia because once you see this truth, once you recognize the false light for what it truly is, you can never unsee it, and your entire understanding of reality, of spirituality, of your own divine nature will be forever transformed. Before I reveal this knowledge that has been hidden from you since the Council of Nicaea deliberately excluded it from the biblical canon, if you are a sincere seeker of hidden truth and want to continue this journey of awakening with me, subscribe now and activate the bell, because what comes next will expose secrets that have been concealed for millennia, and you will not want to miss the next teachings I will share with you as a friend and guide on this path. This is not just another spiritual video. This is an initiation into gnosis, into direct knowing, and once you cross this threshold with me, there is no going back to comfortable illusions. In the next 20 minutes, I will reveal to you exactly what Jesus taught his inner circle about the false light that masquerades as the supreme God, why this being is not your creator but your jailer, how the Orthodox Church was specifically designed to redirect your worship toward this imposter deity, and most importantly, how you can recognize the true divine light within yourself and break free from the cosmic deception that has held humanity captive since the Archons first imprisoned the divine spark in matter. This is not speculation, this is not interpretation. This is direct teaching from the suppressed Gospels, from the Nag Hammadi library that was buried in the Egyptian desert specifically to preserve this knowledge when the Church began its campaign of eradication. What you are about to learn will challenge everything you were taught about God, about Jesus, about the nature of this reality itself. The story begins not in Galilee or Jerusalem, but in the testimony of those who walked closest to Jesus, those who received the secret teachings that were too dangerous, too liberating, too threatening to the emerging power structure to ever be included in the official narrative. In the Gospel of Philip, one of the most explicit Gnostic texts recovered from Nag Hammadi, Jesus speaks plainly about the deception. He explains that there is a power in this world that presents itself as the ultimate authority, that claims to be the creator of all things, that demands worship and obedience, but this power is not the true God. It is the demiurge, the blind God, the arrogant Archon who believes himself to be supreme because he cannot perceive the true pleroma, the actual divine fullness that exists far beyond his limited realm. This being, this false God, created the material world as a prison, and he did so not out of love but out of ignorance and hunger for worship. The entire system of sin, judgment, punishment, and redemption through submission that Orthodox Christianity teaches is the demiurge's system, designed to keep you trapped in the cycle of reincarnation, forever seeking salvation from the very entity that imprisoned you in the first place. Jesus came not to reinforce this system, but to shatter it, to awaken the divine spark within each person, to reveal that you are not a miserable sinner groveling before an angry God, but a fragment of the true divine light temporarily trapped in matter. The Gospel of Thomas, another text the Church tried to destroy, records Jesus saying clearly that the kingdom of God is not coming with signs to be observed. It is not in heaven or on earth, it is already spread upon the earth, and people do not see it because they have been blinded by the false light, conditioned to look outside themselves for salvation, when the very thing they seek is the immortal essence within their own being. This teaching is revolutionary, it is dangerous, because if people realize they carry divinity within themselves, they no longer need priests, they no longer need institutions, they no longer need to beg for mercy from the wrathful deity that Orthodox religion uses to control them through fear. Now, before I go deeper into exactly how the Church corrupted these teachings and established the worship of the false light as official doctrine, I want to ask you something with complete honesty, something that perhaps you have felt but never dared to speak aloud. Have you ever felt, deep in your soul, that something is fundamentally wrong with the God of the Old Testament? That a being who drowns the world, who commands genocide, who punishes people for the simple act of seeking knowledge, who threatens eternal torture for finite disobedience, cannot possibly be the ultimate expression of divine love and truth? That intuition you have felt, that spiritual discomfort when reading about a deity who acts more like a jealous tyrant than an all-knowing, divine parent, that is not blasphemy. That is your divine spark recognizing the deception. That is Gnosis beginning to awaken within you. The Orthodox Church has spent 2,000 years training people to dismiss that inner knowing, to call it pride, to call it sin, to call it the voice of the devil, when in truth it is the voice of your own immortal essence trying to break through the programming. If what I am saying resonates deeply in your heart, if you recognize this struggle between what you have been taught and what your soul knows to be true, write in the comments right now the phrase "I see beyond the false light." This is not just a comment. This is a declaration of spiritual independence. This is your way of telling the universe and all the forces that want to keep you asleep that you have awakened, that you see through the cosmic lies, and that from this moment forward, you reclaim the direct knowledge of truth that is your birthright as a divine spark. And when you comment, you are not only affirming your own awakening, you are also serving as a guide for other seekers who are still groping in the darkness of illusion. Right now, I see beyond the false light, and let your declaration serve as a beacon for others. The historical evidence of this suppression is overwhelming once you know where to look. In the year 325, the Council of Nicaea, convened by Emperor Constantine, took the diverse teachings about Jesus, the multiple Gospels, the various interpretations of his message, and forcibly standardized them into one approved version. Any text that suggested Jesus taught self-deification, that presented Gnosis as the path to liberation, that identified the God of the Old Testament as a lesser being, was declared heretical. The Gospel of Mary was suppressed because it showed Mary Magdalene receiving secret teachings and understanding them better than the male disciples. The Gospel of Thomas was banned because it contained sayings like, "When you make the two one, when you make the inner as the outer and the outer as the inner, then you shall enter the kingdom," teachings that pointed directly to inner transformation rather than external obedience. The Apocryphon of John was buried and forgotten because it explicitly named the demiurge, called Yaldabaoth, as the false god who trapped souls in matter and described the true God, the monad, as an infinite consciousness far beyond the petty deity of conventional religion. But here is what they could not erase. Here is what survived despite centuries of book burning and persecution. The Gnostic Christians, the Cathars of medieval France, the Bogomils of Bulgaria, mystics and seekers throughout history, recognized the same pattern. They saw that the God who demands sacrifice, who trades forgiveness for worship, who created a world of suffering and then blames his creation for that suffering, bears all the characteristics of the Archons described in Gnostic cosmology. These beings, the Archons, exist in the lower realms between the material world and the pleroma, and their entire existence depends on harvesting the emotional and spiritual energy of incarnated souls. Fear, guilt, shame, worship through desperation. These are the emotions the Archons feed upon. And what does Orthodox religion produce in its followers, if not exactly these emotions? You are taught from childhood that you are born sinful, that you are fundamentally broken, that you deserve eternal punishment, and that only by complete submission to the Church's authority and to its angry God can you possibly hope for mercy. This is not love, this is spiritual abuse. This is the system of the demiurge using religion as its most effective tool of control. Jesus understood this system intimately because he came from beyond it. In the Pistis Sophia, one of the most detailed Gnostic texts we possess, Jesus describes the multiple levels of archonic deception, explaining that souls who die without gnosis are intercepted by the Archons who appear as beings of light, who present themselves as angels or divine guides, and who redirect those souls back into reincarnation, back into forgetfulness, back into the prison of matter. The false light is literally that, a counterfeit luminosity that mimics true divine radiance but leads only deeper into bondage. This is why Jesus taught his disciples the secret names, the passwords, the recognition signs that would allow a soul to pass through the archonic realms without being deceived by these false light beings. This is why Gnosis, direct experiential knowledge of your own divine nature, is the only real liberation, because once you know yourself as a spark of the infinite monad, once you recognize your true origin beyond this false creation, the Archons lose all power over you. The Church Fathers understood exactly what they were doing when they suppressed these teachings. Irenaeus of Lyon, writing in the 2nd century, devoted entire volumes to attacking Gnostic Christianity, not because it was false but because it was dangerous to institutional power. If people realized they did not need priests as intermediaries, if they discovered they could access divine truth directly through inner contemplation and gnosis, the entire hierarchical structure would collapse. So the Church built its doctrine on the very foundation Jesus came to dismantle. They made the demiurge, the false creator, into the supreme God. They turned Jesus from a teacher of liberation into a blood sacrifice to appease an angry deity. They transformed his message of awakening into a message of submission. They took the kingdom within and placed it in an external heaven that you could only reach through obedience to their authority. This was not accidental, this was not a simple misunderstanding. This was deliberate theological engineering designed to redirect the worship and spiritual energy of humanity toward the archonic realm, toward the false light, toward the very beings that Jesus warned against. Seekers who have deeply studied these suppressed texts and committed to the practice of Gnostic contemplation report profound shifts in their understanding of reality. One practitioner I know personally spent years feeling tortured by guilt, convinced he was inherently sinful and unworthy, attending church services where he begged for forgiveness from a God who seemed perpetually disappointed in him. When he discovered the Gospel of Thomas and began practicing the meditation Jesus described, the process of making the inner as the outer, of recognizing the divine light within his own awareness, everything changed. He described it as scales falling from his eyes, suddenly seeing that the guilt, the shame, the sense of unworthiness were not coming from within him, but were being imposed from outside, programmed by a religious system designed to keep him spiritually enslaved. He began to perceive the false light for what it was, the energetic signature of the archonic realm, and he learned to distinguish it from the true light, the pure consciousness of the pleroma that radiates from the core of his own being. His prayer life transformed completely, no longer begging an external authority for mercy, but instead communing directly with the infinite awareness that he recognized as his true source, his actual divine parent. The difference, he told me with tears in his eyes, was like the difference between being a prisoner pleading with a guard and being a son remembering his inheritance. This is not an isolated experience. This is the consistent testimony of those who move from orthodox belief to Gnostic knowing. Another seeker, a woman who had been raised in a fundamentalist tradition where she was taught that her body was sinful, that her sexuality was shameful, that her very existence as a woman made her spiritually inferior, discovered the Gnostic Gospels during her darkest period of depression. Reading that Jesus honored Mary Magdalene as his closest disciple, that the Gospel of Mary portrayed her as the one who truly understood his teachings, while the male apostles struggled with jealousy and confusion, awakened something in her that decades of religious conditioning had tried to extinguish. She began to study Sophia, the divine wisdom figure who exists at the highest levels of the pleroma, but whose passion led to the creation of the material realm. And she recognized in this teaching a completely different understanding of the feminine divine. Not the subservient, silent, secondary feminine of Orthodox theology, but Sophia as the active agent of creation, as wisdom itself made manifest. Through contemplative practices based on the thunder perfect mind, a Gnostic text that presents the divine feminine speaking in paradoxes about her nature, this woman experienced what she described as a direct encounter with the true mother, not the wrathful father god of conventional religion, but the infinite nurturing consciousness that exists beyond all gender, yet includes all gender, the source from which her own soul emerged. She wept when she first felt this presence, not from fear or guilt, but from recognition, from finally coming home to a divine truth that honored rather than condemned her existence. These transformations happen because Gnosis is not belief, it is experiential knowledge. It is the direct perception of truth beyond the veil of the false light. When you begin to practice the techniques Jesus actually taught, not the sanitized version in the canonical Gospels, but the full teaching preserved in the texts the Church tried to destroy, you start to perceive layers of reality that were always there but which you were trained not to see. You begin to notice how Orthodox religious imagery, the art, the architecture, the rituals, all subtly reinforce the archonic hierarchy. The cathedrals point upward, directing your attention to an external heaven, never inward to the kingdom within. The rituals position you as supplicant, never as divine inheritor. The prayers emphasize your unworthiness, never your innate godhood. Every element is carefully designed to keep your consciousness trapped in the mindset of the slave, rather than awaken to the truth of the sovereign divine being you actually are. The Gospel of Philip makes this distinction explicitly when it discusses the difference between those who receive Gnosis and those who remain in mere belief. Belief, it explains, is accepting what others tell you about spiritual reality. It is faith without understanding, obedience without knowing why you obey. Gnosis, in contrast, is direct knowing. It is experiencing the divine truth for yourself. It is becoming so certain of your own divine nature that no external authority can ever again convince you that you are anything less than a fragment of infinite consciousness temporarily embodied in matter for the purpose of learning and eventually returning to the pleroma. The text uses the metaphor of light and darkness, but not in the simplistic way Orthodox religion does. Not as good versus evil in some cosmic war where you must pick a side and hope you chose correctly. Instead, it describes the false light as a deceptive luminosity that blinds you to the true light, the way a spotlight can create such glare that you cannot see the stars beyond it. Orthodox religion is that spotlight, brilliant and attention-demanding, creating the illusion that nothing exists beyond its beam, when in reality the true divine radiance is infinitely vaster, is the background consciousness in which even the false light appears. Jesus taught techniques for piercing this veil, for seeing beyond the false light to the true source. In the Gospel of Thomas, saying number 70, he states that if you bring forth what is within you, what you bring forth will save you. But if you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you. This is not metaphorical. This is precise instruction. The divine spark within you, your pneuma, your immortal essence, must be brought forth, must be activated, must be recognized and claimed, or it will remain dormant, and you will be recycled through reincarnation after reincarnation, lifetime after lifetime of suffering in the domain of the demiurge, never breaking free because you never knew there was something to break free from. The bringing forth happens through contemplation, through the practice of inner attention, through learning to distinguish between the voice of your conditioned mind, which speaks in the language of fear and limitation that the Archons programmed into you, and the voice of your divine spark, which speaks in the wordless language of direct knowing, of gnosis, of recognition of truth beyond all mental concepts. Practically, this means developing a daily practice of sitting in silence and turning your attention inward, not to pray to an external God, but to commune with the divine consciousness that is your true nature. You begin by noticing your thoughts without identifying with them, observing how your mind has been programmed with beliefs about unworthiness, sin, separation from the divine, and recognizing that these thoughts are not you. They are the voice of the archonic conditioning speaking through you. As you continue this practice, something remarkable happens. You start to perceive a deeper awareness beneath the thoughts, a consciousness that simply witnesses without judgment, without fear, without the constant narrative of inadequacy that the false religious programming installed in you. This witnessing awareness is your pneuma beginning to awaken, your divine spark recognizing itself. The more you rest in this awareness, the more you realize it is not generated by your brain, it is not a product of your body, it exists prior to your embodiment and will continue after your body dies. This is what the Gnostics meant by knowing yourself, not knowing your personality or your life story, but knowing your true nature as immortal consciousness temporarily using a physical form to navigate the material realm created by the demiurge. As this knowing deepens, you naturally begin to perceive the false light in your external life. You notice how religious institutions use guilt to manipulate behavior, how they promise salvation in exchange for obedience, how they create dependency rather than empowerment. You see clearly that the God they present, the deity who creates beings with free will and then punishes them eternally for using that free will in ways he dislikes, the entity who demands blood sacrifice to forgive offenses against himself, is not exhibiting the qualities of ultimate divine perfection, but rather the qualities of the demiurge, the petty, jealous, limited being who rules this fallen realm and survives by harvesting the worship energy of trapped souls. This seeing is not comfortable. It often creates what the dark night of the soul describes, the period where your old beliefs crumble before the new understanding has fully stabilized. You feel lost because the familiar landmarks of your spiritual life, the prayers, the rituals, the sense of a protective Father God watching over you, reveal themselves as elements of the prison rather than the path to freedom. But if you persist, if you continue the practice of inner attention, if you trust the gnosis arising from your divine spark rather than clinging to the false comfort of the archonic religion, you emerge into a completely different relationship with spirituality. Many practitioners describe this emergence as feeling like they finally woke up from a lifelong dream, or more accurately, a nightmare. One seeker told me that for the first time in his life, he felt truly free to explore spiritual truth without the constant fear that he might be committing blasphemy, might be angering God, might be risking eternal damnation. The moment he understood that the angry, jealous God of orthodoxy was not the true infinite divine, but rather the demiurge trying to maintain its control over souls, an enormous weight lifted from his being. He realized he could question everything, could investigate any spiritual teaching, could experiment with different practices, because he was no longer bound by the fear-based obedience system of the false light. His spirituality became a joyful exploration rather than anxious compliance. He studied the Hermetic texts, the Kabbalah, Buddhist meditation, Vedantic philosophy, always looking for the common thread of gnosis, of direct knowing, that runs through all genuine mystical traditions beneath their cultural and theological differences. And he found that thread consistently, the teaching that you are divine consciousness having a temporary human experience, that liberation comes through recognizing your true nature, that no external savior can do for you what you must do for yourself, which is to awaken from the illusion of separation and remember your origin in the infinite monad. The suppressed saying from the Gospel of Thomas captures this perfectly when Jesus states that whoever finds the interpretation of these sayings will not experience death. Not physical death, which comes to all bodies, but the death of consciousness, the dissolution of self that the Archons use to trap souls in the cycle of forgetfulness and reincarnation. When you achieve Gnosis, when you know yourself as the immortal divine spark, death becomes merely a transition, a shedding of one vehicle and the conscious movement into the next phase of existence, no longer controlled by the archonic machinery that intercepts unawakened souls. This is why the early Gnostics were not afraid of martyrdom, why they could face persecution with such equanimity, because they knew, not believed but knew through direct experience, that their true self could not be killed, that the body was temporary but the pneuma was eternal, that physical death was actually liberation from the densest level of the archonic prison as long as they maintained Gnosis through the transition. If you are feeling your consciousness expanding as you receive this knowledge, if you sense that you are finally hearing the truth that your soul has been hungering for beneath all the religious conditioning, leave your like on this video right now so that more seekers can discover these hidden teachings. The algorithm that controls what content people see is itself a kind of modern archonic system, determining what knowledge reaches consciousness and what remains hidden, but your engagement with this video, your likes and comments and shares, disrupts that control system and allows this Gnosis to spread to others who need it. You are not just a passive consumer of content, you are an active participant in the liberation of consciousness, and every action you take to amplify truth diminishes the power of the false light to maintain its deception. The question that arises for many seekers at this point is whether Christianity itself must be completely abandoned, or whether there is a way to reclaim the original Gnostic teachings of Jesus from beneath the layers of archonic distortion. The answer is nuanced because Jesus himself, the actual historical teacher whose words and actions were later mythologized and weaponized by the institutional church, clearly taught Gnosis, clearly pointed to the divine nature within each person, clearly distinguished between the true unknowable God and the lesser deity that rules this world. The Gospel of John, even in its canonical form, retains traces of this Gnostic teaching when Jesus says that you will know the truth, and the truth will set you free, not believe certain doctrines and hope for salvation, but know truth directly and be liberated by that knowing. The problem is not with the core teaching of Jesus, but with what was built on top of it, the massive theological and institutional structure that transformed his message of awakening into a religion of submission to the false light. So some Gnostic practitioners maintain a relationship with Jesus as a teacher and guide, but they approach him as the Gnostic Christ, the messenger from the pleroma who came to wake people up, not as the blood sacrifice to appease an angry God. They read the canonical Gospels alongside the Nag Hammadi texts, always filtering through the question of whether a particular teaching points toward empowerment and inner knowing or toward external dependency and fear-based obedience. When Jesus says the kingdom of God is within you, that is authentic Gnosis. When later church doctrine says you must be saved through the blood of Christ and membership in the true church, that is archonic distortion. When Jesus says you are the light of the world, that is recognition of your divine nature. When orthodoxy says you are a miserable sinner saved only by grace, that is programming to keep you trapped in the false light system. Learning to discern these differences, to separate the wheat of genuine teaching from the chaff of institutional control, is part of the Gnostic path. Other seekers find that the layers of distortion are so thick, the association of Christianity with the worship of the demiurge, so complete in the collective consciousness, that they prefer to draw their Gnosis from other sources, from Hermeticism, from the Kabbalah, from Vedantic teachings about the Atman being identical to Brahman, from Buddhist insights into the illusory nature of self and the possibility of awakening beyond suffering. All of these traditions, when you penetrate to their mystical core, teach variations of the same truth that consciousness is primary, that your true nature is divine, that liberation comes through direct knowing rather than through belief and ritual, that the material world is a kind of illusion or prison from which awakening is possible. The specific cultural and linguistic forms differ, the metaphors and techniques vary, but the essential Gnosis remains constant across traditions and across millennia, which is precisely why the archonic forces, working through religious and political institutions, have consistently tried to suppress it. The historical pattern is undeniable once you see it. Whenever a mystical teaching that empowers individual spiritual experience begins to spread, institutional religion moves to either co-opt it, diluting the dangerous elements and incorporating the safe bits into orthodox doctrine, or to violently suppress it through accusations of heresy, through inquisitions, through systematic destruction of texts and persecution of practitioners. The Cathars were not exterminated in the Albigensian Crusade because they were wrong, but because they were right, because they taught that the God of the Old Testament was the demiurge, because they lived simply and refused to participate in the corrupt power structures of the medieval church, because they demonstrated that it was possible to access divine truth without priests or sacraments or institutional mediation. The same pattern played out with the Gnostic Christians in the early centuries, with the Hermetic philosophers who were driven underground, episode, with the Kabbalists who had to encode their teachings in deliberately obscure symbolic language to avoid persecution. Any teaching that threatens the monopoly of institutional religion on spiritual authority, that suggests people can find their own way to divine truth, becomes a target for suppression. But here is what gives me hope. What makes me certain that the false light cannot ultimately win, which is that Gnosis cannot be destroyed because it is not dependent on texts or teachings or institutions. Gnosis is the direct experience of your divine nature. And as long as consciousness exists, as long as the divine spark is present within incarnated beings, the possibility of awakening to Gnosis remains. They can burn every book, kill every teacher, destroy every physical trace of the teaching, and still, someone sitting alone in contemplation can discover the same truth directly, can pierce the veil of the false light through their own inner exploration, can recognize themselves as fragments of the infinite divine temporarily embodying in matter. This is what truly terrifies the Archonic forces, not the teachings themselves, but the unteachable direct knowing that arises spontaneously when consciousness turns its attention inward and discovers its own source. If you have not yet subscribed to this channel, do it now, because what we are building here is a community of awakened seekers who support each other in the practice of Gnosis, who share insights and experiences, who refuse to bow before the false light and instead reclaim their divine sovereignty. Every week I reveal suppressed teachings from the Nag Hammadi library, from Hermetic texts, from Kabbalistic wisdom, from the testimony of mystics throughout history who saw through the deception and left records for those who would come after. This is not just information. This is initiation. This is the transmission of Gnosis from one awakened consciousness to another, and I want you to be part of this awakening movement. Subscribe now, activate notifications, and allow me to continue serving as your guide and friend on this pathless path to truth beyond all false lights. The ultimate teaching, the final secret that Jesus revealed to his closest disciples, according to the Apocryphon of John, is that the way out of the Archonic prison is also the way in. You descended into matter through ignorance, through forgetting your divine origin, through being seduced by the false light into identification with the body and the egoic mind. You ascend through Gnosis, through remembering your true nature, through seeing the false light for what it is, and refusing to worship it any longer. The divine spark within you is indestructible. It has always been free. It was never really trapped, except by its own ignorance of itself. The moment you know yourself, truly know yourself as consciousness rather than form, as eternal rather than mortal, as divine rather than sinful, the prison dissolves because you realize it was never real in the first place. It was a construct of perception maintained by ignorance and fear. This is why Jesus laughed at the Archons, why he treated their threats with contempt. Because from the perspective of Gnosis, they have no power except what you give them through your belief in their authority. The practice, then, is not to fight against the Archons, not to wage war against the false light, because that would be playing their game, accepting their reality, feeding them the emotional energy of conflict. The practice is to simply see through them, to recognize them as impermanent phenomena appearing in the infinite consciousness that you are, to withdraw your worship, your fear, your spiritual energy from them and redirect it inward to the true divine source. When you do this consistently, when you make it your daily practice to commune with the infinite awareness that is your true nature, rather than praying to external deities or seeking salvation through institutional religion, something shifts in your entire being. The anxiety that characterized your spiritual life, the constant worry about whether you were good enough, whether you had sinned too much, whether you would be saved or damned, all of that falls away because you realize it was based on a false premise, the idea that you were separate from the divine and needed to earn your way back to it. In truth, you were never separate. You are the divine having a temporary experience of apparent separation, and the return is not a journey to somewhere else but a recognition of what has always been true. Write in the comments, "I reclaim my divine sovereignty," if you are ready to step fully into this truth. If you are done with the false light and its manipulative systems, if you are claiming your birthright as a conscious fragment of the infinite monad, your declaration matters, not because I need to see it, but because you need to speak it, to make it real in your consciousness, to announce to yourself and to the universe that you are no longer a sheep seeking a shepherd, but a divine being remembering its origin. The journey from here is not a straight path because Gnosis is not a linear process of accumulating information. It is a spiral of deepening realization where you return again and again to the same insights but at deeper levels of integration. You will have moments of profound clarity where everything makes sense, where you see the false light clearly and feel completely free of its influence, and then you will have periods where the old conditioning reasserts itself, where doubt creeps in, where you find yourself falling back into familiar patterns of thinking and behaving. This is normal. This is part of the process, because you are not just changing your beliefs. You are rewiring neural pathways that have been carved deep by years or decades, or even lifetimes of Archonic programming. Be patient with yourself. Be compassionate with the part of you that is still afraid, that still wants the false security of the old religious certainties, and keep returning to the practice of inner attention. Keep coming back to the direct knowing of your divine nature. Keep seeing through the false light to the true source within. The Gnostic path is sometimes described as walking a razor's edge because you are navigating between two dangers. On one side, the danger of being pulled back into Orthodox religion and its worship of the false light, and on the other side, the danger of spiritual egotism, of thinking that because you have gnosis, you are better than those who do not, of using your knowledge to judge and condemn rather than to liberate and serve. Jesus warned against both of these in his teachings to the disciples. He said that those who receive gnosis have a responsibility to help others awaken, not by forcing truth upon them, but by living in such a way that others naturally become curious about the source of your peace, your freedom, your joy. You become a light that does not need to proclaim its brightness because it simply shines, and those who are ready to see it will be drawn to it. This brings us to the final revelation, the ultimate secret that completes your understanding of the false light and your relationship to it. The Archonic system, the entire structure of control and manipulation built by the demiurge and maintained through institutional religion, will eventually collapse not through revolution or warfare, but through the simple spreading of gnosis. As more and more individuals awaken to their divine nature, as more souls pierce the veil and recognize the false light for what it is, the energetic foundation of the Archonic realm weakens because it depends entirely on harvested worship and fear from ignorant souls. Every person who achieves gnosis is one less source of food for the Archons, one less battery powering the matrix of deception. This is why your awakening matters, why your practice matters, why your willingness to share this knowledge with others who are ready for it matters. You are not just saving yourself. You are participating in the liberation of all consciousness from the prison of ignorance. The suppressed gospel of truth from Nag Hammadi describes this beautifully when it says that error became powerful when it prepared a substitute for truth, beautiful and attractive. But those who taste true knowledge recognize error for what it is and are never again deceived by it. The false light is that substitute for truth, made attractive through ritual and architecture and the promise of salvation. But once you have tasted gnosis, once you have experienced direct knowing of your divine nature, the false light loses all its appeal. You see it as the cheap imitation it always was. You wonder how you were ever fooled by it, and you feel profound compassion for those still caught in its web, because you remember what it was like to be there, to be seeking salvation from the very forces that keep you imprisoned. Your responsibility now is to integrate this gnosis into your daily life, to let it transform not just your understanding but your actions, your relationships, your entire way of being in the world. This does not mean withdrawing from the world, becoming isolated or antisocial or nihilistic about material existence. The Gnostic path is not about hating the body or despising matter. It is about recognizing that you are not merely matter, that your essential nature transcends the physical while still being able to engage with the physical realm. You can enjoy the beauty of nature, the pleasure of good food, the warmth of human connection, all while remembering that these are temporary expressions of consciousness, not ultimate realities. You participate in life fully without being enslaved by it. You engage with the world without believing the world is all there is. You navigate the domain of the demiurge while always remembering your citizenship in the pleroma. This integrated gnosis is what Jesus modeled in his own life according to the suppressed Gospels. He was fully human, experiencing all the joys and sorrows of embodiment, yet he never lost awareness of his divine origin. He could cry at the death of a friend while knowing that death is not the end. He could feel physical pain during crucifixion while remaining untouched at the core of his being. He could engage with the religious authorities of his time, participating in temple rituals and synagogue discussions, while never accepting their claim to spiritual authority over him. This is the art of living in the world, but not being of the world. The balance that every Gnostic seeker aims for, the ability to navigate the false light's territory without worshipping at its altar. Seekers who achieve this integration describe a profound sense of peace that coexists with engagement, a serenity that does not depend on external circumstances because it arises from knowing who they truly are beneath all the roles and identities. One practitioner told me that she used to be terrified of death, not just the physical pain of dying, but the existential fear of annihilation, and this fear colored every aspect of her life, making her clingy in relationships, anxious about health, desperate to control outcomes. When she discovered gnosis through studying the Nag Hammadi texts and practicing the contemplative techniques of inner attention, her relationship with death completely transformed. She no longer feared it because she knew experientially that her consciousness was not generated by her body, that death would be a transition rather than an ending, that the divine spark within her could not be extinguished. This freed her to live with a boldness and authenticity she had never accessed before, to take risks in service of truth, to speak honestly even when it was uncomfortable, to love without the desperate neediness that fear produces. She became, in her words, dangerous to the false light, not because she opposed it with violence, but because she had withdrawn her worship and could no longer be controlled through fear of death or promises of afterlife rewards. This is what the Archonic system cannot survive. Souls who have achieved Gnosis and no longer participate in the fear-based economy of salvation that keeps the whole structure functioning. You, by engaging with this knowledge, by practicing inner attention, by learning to distinguish the false light from the true source, are becoming such a soul. You are stepping out of the role of victim, of sinner, of sheep, and stepping into your true identity as divine consciousness, having a human experience for purposes of growth and eventual return to the pleroma. This shift is irreversible once it happens at a deep enough level. Once the Gnosis penetrates beyond intellectual understanding into embodied knowing. You cannot unknow what you have known, cannot unsee what you have seen, and this is both the challenge and the gift of the Gnostic path. As we approach the end of this revelation, I want to leave you with 3 practices you can begin immediately to deepen your Gnosis and strengthen your resistance to the false light. The first practice is daily contemplation, where you sit in silence for at least 20 minutes, close your eyes, and simply witness your thoughts without judgment, noticing how most thoughts are variations of fear, lack, and separation, recognizing these as the voice of Archonic conditioning, and gradually becoming aware of the consciousness that observes the thoughts, the awareness that exists prior to thinking. This awareness is your pneuma beginning to know itself. The second practice is discernment, which means evaluating every religious or spiritual teaching you encounter by asking whether it empowers or disempowers you, whether it points you toward your own divine nature or toward external salvation, whether it produces fear and dependency or freedom and self-knowledge. Train yourself to recognize the energetic signature of the false light in teachings, in institutions, in spiritual personalities. The third practice is community, finding other seekers who are on this path of awakening, creating relationships based on mutual support in the practice of Gnosis rather than on shared beliefs or doctrines. We need each other on this journey because the false light is very good at creating isolation, at making awakened souls feel like they are alone and crazy for seeing what they see. If you found this knowledge valuable, if it opened something within you that needed to be opened, if you feel that your consciousness has expanded through receiving these teachings, I need you to do 3 things right now. First, leave your like on this video because that tells the algorithm to show this content to more seekers who are ready for it. Second, subscribe to the channel and activate notifications because I share teachings like this every week, revealing suppressed knowledge from the Nag Hammadi library, from Hermetic texts, from the testimony of awakened mystics throughout history, and I do not want you to miss any transmission that could deepen your Gnosis. Third, share this video with someone in your life who you know is seeking, who has been questioning Orthodox religion, who feels that call toward deeper truth but has not yet found language for what they are experiencing. You sharing this could be the catalyst that ignites their awakening. Next week, I will reveal the specific techniques Jesus taught for traversing the Archonic realms after death, the passwords and recognition signs that allow an awakened soul to pass through the false light beings that try to intercept and redirect consciousness back into reincarnation. This is knowledge from the Pistis Sophia that has been kept hidden for 17 centuries, and it is perhaps the most practical teaching you can receive because eventually every one of us will face death and the transition that follows. Those who have Gnosis, who know these techniques, who can maintain awareness through the dissolution of the body, will not be trapped by the Archonic recycling system. They will pass through consciously into reunion with the pleroma. This is your birthright, this is your destiny, and I am here to guide you every step of the way as your friend and mentor on this path. Remember, you are not a sinner seeking mercy from an angry God. You are not a sheep needing a shepherd. You are not broken and in need of salvation from outside yourself. You are a divine spark of infinite consciousness, temporarily incarnated in matter for the purpose of experience and growth. And the only thing standing between you and full recognition of your true nature is the conditioning imposed by the false light. That conditioning can be dissolved through Gnosis, through direct knowing, through the practices I have shared with you today. Begin now, not tomorrow, not when conditions are perfect, but now in this moment, turning your attention inward, seeking the light that needs no external source because it shines from your own divine essence. The kingdom is within, the way is within, the truth is within, and you have everything you need right now to take the first step on the pathless path to liberation. I will be here, creating content every week, serving as your guide, but ultimately you must walk this path yourself because Gnosis cannot be given, it can only be discovered through your own direct experience. Go now, awaken, see through the false light, reclaim your divine sovereignty, and know yourself as what you have always been. Infinite consciousness playing in the fields of form, eternal spirit learning through temporary embodiment, the beloved child of the true God beyond all gods, returning home to the pleroma after wandering in the realm of shadows.